You know, before we go anywhere tonight, before the story begins, its slow unwinding, I want you to know something. We care about you here, truly. You're not just a viewer or a listener in the dark. You're part of the circle, the one we keep warm, the one we tell these late-night stories for, so you can rest a little easier when the world feels too loud. Wherever you are, whatever you've been carrying today, it's safe to set it down now. So, before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. He was only a boy the first time the stars went out. It didn't happen with thunder or panic. No alarms, no great flash, just one moment they were there, scattered and breathing quietly above the neighborhood rooftops, and the next they were gone, as though some careful hand had brushed the whole sky clean. Rick sat on the edge of his bed, his knees tucked up, the window open to the cool hum of summer crickets. He thought maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. He blinked once, twice, still no stars. The sky was a smooth, heavy darkness, the kind that makes you feel like the world has been folded into something smaller. In that strange absence, he felt something stir. Not fear, well, not exactly. More like a hollow, an echo he didn't have the words for. The kind of feeling you get when you know something precious is missing, but you can't prove it to anyone. He padded down the hall in his socks, past the soft rasp of the fridge and the low snore of a sleeping house. He almost woke his mother to tell her, but stopped at her door. He didn't want her to look and say, "It's fine, Ricky. You're imagining it." He needed it to be real, even if only to himself. So he went outside. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. The silence felt rounder somehow, thick enough to press against his ears. For a long moment, he just stood there in the yard, looking up at that empty sky, and made a quiet promise he wouldn't even remember making until much later in life. When the stars came back, 10 minutes later, sudden and shy as if they'd been caught hiding, he noticed one of them was not where it had been before. It winked at him, faint but deliberate, and in that instant the hollow inside him became a compass. He didn't know yet that it was pointing toward a person, far away, whose laugh would someday change everything. He went back to bed, the crickets still singing, the stars pretending they'd never been gone. But Rick knew, and knowing made the night feel different, in a way that would never fully leave him. Rick didn't receive many gifts as a child, not the kind you could keep in your pocket anyway. Most things he was given came in the form of hand-me-down books, half-finished toys, or small boxes of bolts his father said might be useful someday. But one afternoon, when the light in the kitchen was soft and golden, his grandmother slid something across the table to him with a quiet smile. It was a compass, though, not quite like any compass he'd ever seen. The face was a deep amber, scratched but warm to the touch, and the needle didn't twitch toward north like it should. Instead, it spun lazily in slow circles, only to stop when someone laughed near it. Even the smallest chuckle could make it tremble, point, and settle, as if it knew exactly where joy was hiding. She didn't explain it, didn't say where she'd found it, or if it was broken. She just told him, "Keep it with you. It'll help you find the good stuff." Then she patted his hand and went back to peeling potatoes. For days, Rick tested it in secret. He'd walk around the block, pretend to trip and see if the neighbor kids laughed. He'd whistle under his breath just to make the dog bark. And there it would go, the little needle jerking toward the sound like a loyal pet. He even tried it late at night, whispering jokes into the dark, wondering if it could find the stars themselves. The compass didn't always point to what he wanted. Sometimes it led him to his mother's laugh in the laundry room, low and tired but still warm. Other times it drew him toward the muffled sound of a sitcom playing in someone else's house far away. And once, just once, it pulled toward the empty street behind the schoolyard when no one was there at all, until he heard it. A single, soft laugh, almost like a sigh. It was the first time he realized joy didn't have to be loud, that sometimes the quietest ones meant the most. Years later, when he was far from that kitchen and the sky was full of colors he couldn't name, Rick would still take the compass out and watch it spin. By then, he knew it wasn't pointing to north, it was pointing to her. And though he didn't understand it yet, that compass was already leading him toward the moment his life would change, not with a bang, but with a smile. Some homes smell like nothing. Others smell like pine cleaner or dust, or the faint trace of old carpet. Rick's childhood home had two smells that never seemed to fade, no matter the season: warm bread and the thin metallic whisper of ozone. The bread came from his mother. She baked when she was worried, kneading her thoughts into the dough, letting them rise in quiet bowls under tea towels. There was something steady in the way she worked, flour softening her hands, the air slowly filling with that safe, golden scent. Even on the bad days, it reminded Rick there were things that could be made better just by waiting long enough. The ozone was his doing. He was always tinkering, even when he didn't understand what the pieces were for. In the corner of the kitchen, tucked between the pantry and the back door, he'd claimed a little stretch of counter for his experiments. Small things, mostly. Tiny spinning motors, old wires, glass jars that clicked when you touched them. His mother never complained, though she often shook her head when sparks snapped or strange colors bloomed in the air. "Just don't set the curtains on fire, Ricky," she'd say, sliding a fresh loaf from the oven. The two smells would meet there, in that little room, the warm pull of bread and the sharp tingle of invention. And Rick would sit at the table, chin in his hands, staring at the way sunlight caught the dust in the air, thinking about how one scent felt like the past and the other like the future. One evening, as a storm drifted in, he tried to explain this to his grandmother. She was slicing bread, her movements slow and practiced. He told her it was like the house itself was split in two, one half made for holding you still, the other half trying to push you somewhere new. She smiled without looking up and said, "That's what a good home is, Ricky. Somewhere that lets you rest and somewhere that lets you leave." It was one of those sentences that didn't fully land until years later, when the leaving part came for him in ways he never expected. But in that moment, he just nodded, chewed a warm slice, and pretended not to notice the compass on the table, its little needle twitching toward the faint sound of laughter in the storm. It was late. The kind of late when the house has stopped breathing with you, when the air feels older somehow. Rick lay awake, the covers pulled up to his chin, the hum of the refrigerator carrying faintly down the hall. He wasn't thinking of anything in particular, just letting his eyes trace the ceiling shadows, when he heard it. A whisper. It wasn't a voice he recognized. It was low, soft, almost like the sound you make when turning a page slowly. At first, he thought it might have been the wind pressing against the glass. But then it came again, 3 syllables, careful, deliberate. They didn't make sense to him, not yet. Still they felt, meant for him. He slid out of bed and padded over to the window. Outside, the streetlight burned pale in the damp air, catching the tiny dance of moths in its glow. The yard was empty, the sidewalk was empty, the world seemed emptied out entirely, except for that sound. Rick pressed his palm to the glass. Cold. He leaned forward until his forehead touched it, trying to listen harder, and then faint, like it was coming from a great distance. A laugh. Not loud, not full, just a single exhale that carried the shape of a smile. The compass on his nightstand gave a little click. He stayed there a long time, staring into the dark. He didn't open the window. He didn't call for anyone. It felt like something he was supposed to keep for himself. A secret gift, even if he didn't know why. Later, as he drifted into sleep, the words, whatever they were, blurred at the edges like ink left out in the rain. But the feeling they left him with was sharp and strange, and a little like finding the first page of a book without a title. Rick began drawing worlds before he knew the names of the streets in his own town. It started with small, wobbly sketches on the backs of grocery lists, crooked rivers, forests shaped like spirals, islands that floated in the margins. But over time, the maps grew bigger. They stretched across entire pieces of butcher paper his mother brought home from the store, so wide and strange they couldn't be folded without losing something important. He didn't draw them the way other kids did. His oceans weren't just blue, they had shadows, places where the water dipped into impossible depths. His cities curved like question marks as if they were leaning in to listen. And in the far corners he always left blank spaces, not because he ran out of ideas, but because something in him liked the thought of a place he didn't yet understand. One evening, while rain tapped the windows, his grandmother stood over his shoulder as he worked. She traced a finger over a small peninsula he'd drawn, her touch careful not to smudge the pencil lines. "And what's this place called?" she asked. Rick hesitated. "I don't know yet." She smiled. "Sometimes the best places don't tell you their names until you've been there." That night, after she'd gone to bed, he kept staring at that nameless place. For some reason, it felt heavier than the others, as if there was already a story there, folded away, waiting for him to find it. Over the next weeks, he began filling the maps with pathways no one else could see. Lines that curved like the laugh he'd heard at the window, shapes that reminded him of the way the compass spun when it caught joy in the air. One path, thin and careful, seemed to weave through every world he drew. He didn't know where it ended, and though he was still years away from portals and equations, somewhere deep down he understood. The maps weren't just places, they were directions to someone. By the time Rick met her, the maps had stopped being on paper. They'd moved into his mind, lines of possibility, corners of space he could walk through without ever leaving the room. He was older now, sharper in thought, quicker in speech, yet still carrying that quiet hollow from the night the stars disappeared. She came into his life on an ordinary afternoon, the way important things sometimes do, without warning, without ceremony. She was leaning over a half-finished piece of machinery in the school lab, her hair falling forward like a curtain. Rick almost said something clever, but the moment he saw the way her eyes lit up at the hum of the motor, he forgot to. They spoke in short bursts at first. Numbers, theories, sketches. It was strange how quickly the conversation stopped being about the project and started being about everything else. She'd scribble formulas that made him pause, not because they were perfect, but because they left room for play. He'd add a line, she'd erase it. They'd argue in the soft, smiling way that feels like music. One day, she drew a spiral on the corner of his notebook. He knew that spiral. He'd drawn it years ago on one of his maps, the path that wound through every world, the one he never understood. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. She just shrugged, eyes glinting. "I thought it looked nice." They started leaving little puzzles for each other, an equation with a missing variable, a diagram that hinted at more, Sometimes the answers were scientific. Sometimes they were personal. Once, he solved a problem she'd given him and found it spelled out a single word: stay. It wasn't love at first sight. It was slower, quieter, something that built itself in the spaces between sentences. But looking back, Rick would always think of those early days as the time he began writing her into his work. Not as a name, but as a constant, a fixed point the rest of the universe could turn around. And though he wouldn't admit it then, even to himself, he'd already started building the first of many things he hoped might keep her close. They didn't mean to drift apart. It just happened the way seasons do, and not suddenly, but in quiet degrees you only notice when you look back. She was still in his life, but the days grew busier, the distances longer. There were moments when their paths would cross, bright as comets, and then fade again into separate skies. Rick told himself it was fine. He had work, projects, equations that kept him awake into the blue hours of morning. But some nights, when the air was still, he'd catch himself listening for something he couldn't name. It was on one of those nights that he heard her again, not in person, not in any place he could touch, but through the thin, grainy hum of a machine on his workbench. He was tuning a transmitter, fingers absently adjusting dials, when a faint crackle turned into a rhythm. Not words, not yet. Just a pattern he recognized without understanding why. Then softly, like a sound carried from another room, came a laugh. It wasn't the same as in the school lab. There was more space around it now, like it had been traveling a long time to reach him. Still it was hers. He knew the shape of it instantly. Rick leaned closer, barely breathing, afraid that moving might break the connection. The signal faded, came back, wavered. He spoke her name into the static, not expecting an answer, and didn't get one. But the hum shifted like a curtain brushing against the air, and then the laugh returned, shorter this time, almost shy. For the next week he left the transmitter running while he worked. Some nights it stayed silent. Other nights it carried fragments. The scrape of a chair, the echo of a sigh, the faint hum of music he didn't recognize. He never asked her about it. Part of him feared that if he did, the magic of it would vanish. In the years ahead, there would be grander inventions, louder moments, flashes of brilliance and ruin. But that quiet static, the way it felt to hear her in the in-between, would stay with him. A reminder that not all connections need to be seen to be real. They didn't see each other often anymore. When they did, it always felt like the air itself slowed down to make room for the moment. Sometimes it would be in the middle of a crowded place, a hallway, a lab, the corner of some strange new dimension neither of them had planned to visit. Other times it was quiet, almost secret, like meeting in the eye of a storm no one else noticed was there. In those brief pauses, the rest of the world seemed to lean away. Her hand brushing his as they passed, something between them. The faintest touch to his shoulder when she leaned over to see what he was working on. Once, in a moment so small it almost didn't happen, she tucked a stray bit of hair behind his ear, her fingers warm against his temple. He never said much in those moments. Words felt too slow for the strange gravity between them. Instead, he memorized them. The way her eyes held an expression that was both knowing and far away, the rhythm of her breath when she stood close enough for him to hear it. It wasn't the kind of closeness that asked for anything. It didn't demand, it just existed, quietly, in the space between seconds. And maybe that was why it mattered so much, because they both knew the next moment would pull them apart again, into work, into distance, into the endless stretch of other lives. Rick learned to measure time differently during those years, not in hours or days, but in the spaces between when he last saw her and when he might see her again. Every touch, no matter how brief, felt like a thread tying him to a place he couldn't chart on any map. He didn't call it love, not yet. But he knew that when she was near, the compass in his pocket spun slower, steadier, as if it had finally found what it had been searching for. It started as a joke. They were sitting on the back steps of an old building, the afternoon warm enough to make the air shimmer, when she sighed and said, "If I could, I'd keep this exact moment in a jar. Open it again in winter. Just sit in it like this." Rick smiled, the small, crooked kind he only used with her, and said, "Why not?" By the next time they met, he'd built something. It looked like a glass jar, but the lid was threaded with wires, and the glass had a faint, golden tint, as if it were already holding sunlight inside. He told her it could store not just the light and sound, but the feeling of a moment. She didn't believe him, not until he handed her the jar, and she heard the faraway hum of that warm afternoon, smelled the faint scent of grass and distant rain. They started making more, not every time they saw each other, only when the air felt just right, when the laughter came easily, when the sky seemed to be leaning in to listen. They bottled the quiet of early mornings in empty parks, the slow turning of pages in a bookshop, the drowsy warmth of sitting side by side on a train without speaking. Some jars they kept for themselves, others they traded, so each would have a piece of the other's days. Rick labelled his with small, cryptic notes. "First Frost," her song, almost said it. She wrote hers in looping script, the way you looked up, "Not rain, not yet," under the orange light. Years later, when they were far apart, Rick would sometimes open one of her jars late at night. The air inside would be warm, golden, and full of something he couldn't quite name, a kind of quiet that made the edges of the world feel softer. And though he never admitted it out loud, those jars were the only invention he never tried to improve. Some things, he learned, didn't need to be made better. They just needed to be kept. It wasn't sudden. That's the thing people misunderstand about endings. They rarely come with a single moment, a single word, a clean break. More often, they dim, slowly, like a lantern running out of oil. He noticed it first in her eyes, not in the way they looked at him, that stayed the same, warm and knowing, but in the way they drifted when she thought he wasn't looking, as though they were measuring distances he couldn't see. They still met, still laughed, still traded jars of bottled moments, but there was a hesitation now, a pause before she reached for his hand, an unspoken question behind her smile. He told himself it was nothing, just life, just the way things change. One evening, they sat in the lab with the soft hum of machinery filling the air. She was leaning over a small circuit board, her hair catching the light in a way he knew by heart. He glanced up from his work and caught her watching him, not with curiosity, but with a kind of sadness that didn't belong in the room. "What?" he asked, trying to make it light. She shook her head. "Nothing." But her voice carried the faintest tremor, like a string pulled too tight. That night, after she left, he noticed the compass on his desk spinning slowly, endlessly, not settling in any direction. It had never done that before. He tried to adjust it, to reset whatever mechanism guided it, but no amount of tinkering brought it still. The next time they met, the air between them felt colder. Not cruel, not distant, just thinner, as if something had been quietly taken away. He kept waiting for the moment it would return, for the light to flare back to life. But days passed, weeks. And in some quiet part of himself, Rick knew the lantern was almost empty. He didn't do it all at once. At first, it was small things. Tuning out the songs that reminded him of her, leaving certain drawers unopened, skipping streets they used to walk together. These were the easy edits, the shallow cuts. But the mind is stubborn, and hers was everywhere. In the way the light slanted through his workshop windows, in the way laughter carried across a quiet room, in the way the compass sometimes spun just so, as if it still knew. One evening, after too many nights of trying not to think about her, he began designing something different from anything he'd built before. Not a machine to find, or to create, or to change the world, but a machine to unmake a part of it. His part of it. It started with diagrams on scraps of paper, the lines more hesitant than usual, circuits that didn't lead anywhere unless you understood what they were meant to erase. He told himself it was just an experiment, a thought puzzle. But even as the pieces came together, he knew exactly what it was for. The first test was on small memories, the taste of a certain candy from childhood, the color of a sweater he once owned. They slipped away easily, leaving only faint outlines. Encouraged, he moved to bigger ones, a day in summer, a conversation by the river, a look across a crowded room. But when he tried to erase the sound of her laugh, the machine faltered. The memory dimmed, yes, but it didn't disappear. Instead, it broke apart, scattering into fragments that hid in unexpected places. The whistle of a kettle, the hiss of static, the wind moving through an open window. He realized then that some memories aren't kept in one place. They live in too many corners, in too many echoes, to be unmade. And so the machine sat unfinished on his bench, wires trailing like the loose ends of a thought. He didn't dismantle it, he just stopped touching it, leaving it there like a silent agreement between him and the past. Some things, no matter how heavy, are meant to be carried. It wasn't on any map he'd drawn. The portal opened to a place that felt half-finished, half-forgotten. Streets lined with buildings whose windows glowed faintly, though no one moved inside. The air was warm, but the kind of warmth that comes from being wrapped in too many blankets, soft and heavy. Rick stepped through, the sound of his boots swallowed almost immediately. No wind, no footsteps, but his own. It was as if the entire city had decided to rest at once, every clock stopping mid-tick. He didn't know why he'd come here except that something in him had been restless, the compass in his pocket trembling in slow, uneven circles. Maybe, he thought, this was one of those blank spaces he'd left on his maps long ago, the ones waiting for him to arrive. He wandered for hours, past cafes where coffee cups sat cooling beside open books, past a train station where the doors stood open but no one boarded. Even the fountains were still, their water caught in mid-arc like a photograph. There was a peace to it, but also an ache. Every street felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for someone it had lost. He thought of her without meaning to, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the way her hand, sometimes, lingered on a doorframe before leaving a room. In the center of the city, he found a square with a single bench beneath a tree. Its leaves were caught in mid-fall, suspended as if time had paused just for them. Rick sat, the wood cool beneath his palms, and let the silence settle into him. For a moment, he thought he heard something. Faint, distant. Not laughter this time, but the shape of her voice, as though carried through walls too thick to break. He closed his eyes, held still, and tried to catch it. But when he opened them, the sound was gone, and the compass needle had stilled, pointing nowhere. He left the city through the same portal, glancing back only once. The building stood quiet, unchanged, a place still waiting for its someone to return. The table wasn't supposed to be there. It was set in the middle of a long, empty platform. No station, no trains, just endless tracks disappearing into a fog that never lifted. 2 chairs, 2 cups of coffee, steam curling lazily in the still air. Rick hesitated, one hand still on the edge of the portal frame. He didn't remember building this place, didn't remember finding it. Yet it felt inevitable. She was already sitting there, not the exact her he remembered, a little older, a little quieter in the way she held herself. But her eyes still carried that same mixture of mischief and gentleness, the way sunlight carries the same warmth no matter where it falls. He took the seat across from her. The coffee was exactly how he used to make it for her. A little too strong, a little too sweet. They didn't talk right away. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but deliberate, like they were both afraid words might break whatever had allowed this to happen. When she finally spoke, it was simple. "You're not supposed to be here." "I could say the same," he murmured. She smiled faintly at that, but there was a sadness in it too. "This isn't the version of me you're looking for. And you're not the version of you I knew." "I know," he said. And he did. This was a branch of a branch, a place that shouldn't exist, a meeting carved out of impossible odds, but here they were. 2 people with matching ghosts, holding them carefully between sips of coffee. For a while, they talked about nothing. The kind of nothing that is really everything. Weather in places they'd never both been. Small, strange things they'd noticed in passing. She laughed once, quietly, and the compass in his pocket gave a tiny, involuntary spin. When the coffee was gone, they both sat a moment longer, neither wanting to stand first. Eventually, she said, "If you keep coming back here, this place will stop being real." Rick nodded. He didn't promise he wouldn't return, but he didn't say he would. Instead, he reached across the table, and for a brief second their hands touched. Warm, steady, familiar in a way that felt older than either of them. Then he stepped back, through the portal, and when he looked again, the table was gone. It's strange the way silence takes form when you're not looking. In Rick's garage, it didn't just hang in the air, it seeped into things, settled in the corners, curled around unfinished projects. It bent the posture of tools, slowed the flicker of light bulbs. He'd notice it when he wasn't meaning to. The way the workbench felt wider than it used to. The way his pen paused halfway through a note, as though expecting another set of eyes to read over his shoulder. Even the smell of soldering smoke seemed softer, as if sound itself had learned to tread lightly here. Some inventions came out sharper in those days. Cleaner lines, precise edges, machines that didn't hum as much as whisper. Others were different. Fragile little devices that didn't do much except hold a memory like a pressed leaf. One spun a slow spiral of light across the wall, imitating the way sun had once fallen across her face in the morning. Another made the faint sound of a kettle boiling in the next room, though no water was ever heated. He never admitted which ones were for her, never labeled them. But they gathered anyway, small and patient, waiting on shelves as though they knew the one they were meant for might wander in at any moment. Sometimes he'd catch himself talking to the empty space between the workbench and the window. Short mutterings, half a joke, the kind of thing you only say when you expect someone to hear it. And in those moments, the silence shifted. Not gone, not broken, but shaped into something softer. At night, when the garage went dark, those little devices kept working in the quiet. They didn't buzz or whir or call attention to themselves. They just existed, holding their shapes, their light, their sound, like pieces of a world that refused to be completely lost. Rick didn't touch them much after building them. He didn't need to. Sometimes it's enough to know something is still there, keeping its promise without asking for anything in return. It was tucked between the pages of an old manual. The kind of manual that no one ever really reads. Diagrams in faded ink, instructions in a font that made every sentence look slightly apologetic. He hadn't opened it in years, maybe decades. But when the paper slipped free and floated to the floor, he knew before he picked it up what it was. The handwriting was his, but smaller, neater. From a time when his hands shook less, when he still thought words could be precise enough to hold a feeling without breaking it. He didn't read it right away. He just sat there, the folded paper between his fingers, letting the weight of it press into his skin. Part of him was afraid that if he unfolded it, it would crumble. Not from age, but from everything it had been carrying all this time. When he finally did, the words were simple. Not clever, not technical. No diagrams, just a few lines about a day they'd spent in a place that no longer existed, and how he'd thought about it every day since. A note that wasn't about asking her back, or explaining anything, or fixing what had happened. It was just a thank you. A thank you for a smile she'd given him once. One he'd never been able to forget, even in the darker years. He'd never mailed it. He could see in the way the ink trailed off in one corner that he'd paused while writing, maybe thinking of what would happen if she read it, maybe thinking of what would happen if she didn't. It didn't matter now. The version of her who might have received it was gone, scattered across timelines like stardust. And still, he didn't throw it away. He folded it carefully and slid it back between the pages of the manual, as though that was where it belonged, hidden but not lost. Sometimes keeping something to yourself isn't about secrecy. Sometimes it's about letting a thing stay whole, untouched by the world's noise. The signal was faint. Not the sharp pulse of a distress call, not the messy scramble of radio chatter. Just a single tone, soft and steady, like a memory holding its breath. Rick had almost ignored it. He told himself he was just following it out of habit, the way you follow a song you think you've heard before. The planet it led him to was small, barely more than a curved horizon of pale grass. No trees, no oceans, just a single wind that seemed to know exactly where it was going. The source of the signal was buried beneath the surface, a smooth, silver disc no bigger than a dinner plate. When he touched it, it warmed under his hand, and the tone shifted. Not louder, just clearer. And then he heard it. Not a recording, not words, just her voice, shaped into a sound he knew too well, the kind that lives somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. It wasn't saying anything, but it didn't need to. It was the exact sound she'd made once, leaning against a doorway, when they'd been watching a storm through the window. He stood there for a long time, listening. The sky dimmed, but the voice stayed, circling through the air like it had been waiting for someone who would recognize it. There were no coordinates attached, no timestamp, no explanation of how it had been captured or why it had ended up here. Maybe she'd left it for him. Maybe she hadn't even known. The universe was full of strange echoes, fragments that refused to fade entirely. When the wind picked up, it carried the sound across the grass, blending it with the hum of the planet's surface. Rick let it play until the stars rose, then carefully placed the disc back in its hollow. Some things aren't meant to be taken. Some are meant to be found again, when the time is right. It wasn't the kind of place you found on a map. The bar didn't have a name, at least not one written anywhere, and the door looked more like an accident than an entrance. You didn't walk there so much as drift into it, usually when you were too tired to notice the distance between one thought and the next. Rick had been there before, years ago. The ceiling was low, the lights were dim enough to feel like dusk no matter the time, and the air had the faint taste of something old, not stale, but settled, like pages in a book that hadn't been opened in a long while. He sat at the counter. The bartender, an older man with the slow movements of someone who had seen everything twice, poured him something amber without asking. It wasn't until a few sips in that Rick noticed the woman at the far end of the bar. She was talking to the bartender in low tones, and every so often she'd laugh. Not a sharp laugh, but one that seemed to sink into the air around it. When she caught Rick's glance, she tilted her head. "You knew her, didn't you?" The question was soft, but it landed like a stone in still water. Rick didn't ask who she meant. He didn't have to. "I remember her," the woman said. "Not the way most do, not for the things she did, but for the way she listened. She could make you think your story mattered, even if it didn't." Rick nodded slowly, the glass warm in his hand. He wanted to ask how she'd known her, where they'd met, what they'd talked about. But the woman didn't offer details, and he didn't press. Some stories are better when they're half-shadow. When he left, the bar felt even quieter than before, as if a layer of the past had just brushed past him on its way out. And as he walked away, Rick realized something. Even in the corners of the universe he thought were untouched, she had left traces. Not always in grand gestures, sometimes just in the way someone spoke, or the way a laugh lingered after the sound was gone. There's a quiet moment in the dark, when words hover just beyond your lips. Rick found himself there one night, alone in his dimly lit lab, surrounded by humming machines and scattered notes. The air felt thick, not with urgency, but with something heavier, more patient. He reached for a glass, paused, then set it down. The silence pressed in, not demanding but inviting. His thoughts traced the edges of a name he hadn't said aloud in years. It was a name that felt like a whisper, caught between sleep and waking, fragile and unsteady. He wanted to say it. Not to call her back or plead for something lost, but to simply speak it into the space where memories drift. The sound was almost there. A breath, a shiver, a sigh, but the words never quite formed. Instead, he let the quiet swell around him, a soft tide folding him in. The machines hummed their lullaby, the lights dimmed a shade lower, and time stretched out like a slow, gentle breath. Sometimes the absence of a word can say everything. Sometimes the silence is a kind of love. Rick closed his eyes and let the night hold him. There was a drawer he never opened much, not because it was locked or hidden, but because it held a weight that felt heavier than anything else in the room. It was tucked beneath his workbench, plain and unassuming, just another compartment among many. Inside, things lay scattered like whispers. A folded piece of paper with a corner torn off, a half-burned candle stub, a small stone that had once been warm in her hand. Nothing flashy. Nothing meant to be remembered loudly. Rick often found himself standing there, fingers hovering above those quiet relics, feeling the pull of memories tangled in their silence. They weren't reminders of grand adventures or heroic deeds. They were soft traces of ordinary moments, small breaths of a life they might have shared. One item, a simple, worn notebook, was his favorite. Its pages held sketches of stars he'd charted for her, notes about constellations named after laughter and quiet mornings. None of it made much sense to anyone but him. He didn't take the drawer's contents out to look at often. Sometimes, just knowing they were there, safe and untouched, was enough, like a secret kept between two shadows. He believed some memories don't need retelling, they just need a place to rest. It arrived without fanfare, no warning, no flashing lights or alarms, just a small package, wrapped in plain paper that had seen better days, resting on the doorstep of a lab that was too cluttered to be tidy. Rick stared at it for a long moment, fingers tracing the rough edges of the paper, feeling the weight of something more than its size. The package was light, but it carried a heaviness that settled deep inside him. Inside, he found a single object, a small, hand-carved figurine worn smooth by time. It wasn't remarkable by any usual standard, just a shape, almost abstract, but somehow familiar. It reminded him of the way she used to watch clouds drift across the sky, quiet and patient. There was no note, no explanation, just the gift and the silent message it carried across the distance between what was and what could never be undone. Rick didn't know who had sent it, or why, but holding it, he felt something gentle bloom, a quiet kindness reaching through the vastness of space and time. Sometimes the smallest things are the loudest echoes, and sometimes even the quietest gifts can remind you that you're still seen. There was a song, not one you could hum easily or one that played on repeat in a crowded room. It was a melody woven from quiet moments, like the gentle tapping of rain on a window or the slow sigh of a breeze through leaves. Rick first heard it when he wasn't really listening. A faint thread of sound slipping through the hum of his machines, brushing against the edges of his mind. It was familiar, though he couldn't place it. As nights passed, the melody grew, a tender, elusive thing that wound itself around memories and dreams. It wasn't just music, it was a feeling, a whisper of something lost and yet always present. Sometimes, when the world grew too loud or too still, Rick would close his eyes and let the song carry him. It didn't ask for attention or demand answers. It simply was a soft, steady presence that held him when words failed. The song never left. And maybe it never needed to. The stars had always been there. Quiet witnesses to things that didn't need to be spoken aloud. On clear nights, Rick would find himself outside, looking up at the endless scatter of light. It wasn't about navigation or discovery. It was about presence. One star in particular caught his eye. Not the brightest, not the oldest, just a soft, steady glow, steady as a heartbeat in the vastness. He imagined it as a silent companion, a light holding vigil through all the quiet nights. He thought about the moments it had witnessed. Small kindnesses, private griefs, laughter that vanished too soon. He pictured her somewhere beneath that same sky, perhaps looking up too, even if the distance between them was endless. The last star he watched didn't shine for him or for her. It simply shone because that's what stars do. And sometimes that's enough. There is a place just before sleep. That soft, tender space where thoughts begin to float free and the world feels like a whispered secret. Rick knew it well. It was a moment that came without hurry, without demand. In that gentle pause, memories and hopes mingled without weight or worry. Faces blurred softly, voices faded into lullabies sung by the night itself. It was neither here nor there, but a quiet bridge suspended between what was and what might be. He often found himself lingering there, letting the calm wrap around him like a warm shawl. It wasn't about forgetting or escaping, but about simply being. Sometimes the most important things happen in silence. Sometimes the heart speaks loudest when no words are spoken. And in that moment, Rick felt something he hadn't dared to name. peace. Sometimes shadows don't fade away. They linger in the corners of a room, in the spaces between words, in the quiet moments when no one is looking. Rick had learned this slowly, as if the universe itself was teaching him to see what's hidden in plain sight. This shadow wasn't dark or frightening, it was familiar, a gentle presence that followed him, like the echo of a laugh or the soft warmth of a hand once held. It didn't ask for anything, didn't demand attention, it simply stayed, a quiet companion in the endless quiet. He found comfort in that, in knowing that even when everything else slipped away, some parts remained, not as burdens, but as gentle reminders of what had been. Sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones you can't touch. Sometimes the quietest presence is the one that stays the longest. Letting go is not forgetting. It's not erasing memories or closing doors. It's a quiet act of kindness, a soft unfolding of the heart that allows space for new light to enter. Rick sat by the window, watching shadows stretch and blend with the coming night. In the fading light, he felt the weight of everything he had carried: love, loss, regret, and hope gently ease, as if the air itself was breathing with him. He didn't need answers anymore. He didn't need to fix or fight. What mattered was the quiet acceptance of what had been and the gentle promise of what still could be. Sometimes love is not about holding tight, but about setting free. And in that freedom there is a peace deeper than any star, softer than any lullaby,